What if the world you live in arrived late on purpose? Imagine this for a moment. Somewhere in history, a person builds something extraordinary. Not a weapon, not a palace, not a machine designed only for war or profit, but something that could change ordinary life forever. A cleaner engine, a safer source of energy, a medical breakthrough, a communication system years ahead of its time, a design so effective, so disruptive, so dangerous to existing power that it never gets the future it deserves. Not because it failed, but because it was buried. Patents disappear into drawers. Inventors are discredited. Funding vanishes. Powerful interests step in. The press goes quiet. The public forgets. And over time, the invention doesn't just disappear from the market. It disappears from memory. We like to imagine history as a straight line of progress, one great discovery leading naturally to the next. But history doesn't move in a straight line. It moves through power, through money, through war, through ego, through fear. And sometimes the most important inventions are not the ones that change the world. Sometimes the most important inventions are the ones that were prevented from changing it. This is Silenced Inventions, Erased from History, a documentary series about the ideas, devices, and breakthroughs that seemed ready to alter civilization, and then were pushed into obscurity, delayed, absorbed, mocked, bought, classified, or simply forgotten. In part 1, we begin with a disturbing possibility. What if some inventions didn't vanish because they were useless, but because they were too useful? One invention doesn't live or die by truth. We grow up believing a comforting myth. If something works, the world will eventually recognize it. If an invention is valuable, it will succeed. If a discovery can help humanity, it will rise to the surface. But that is not how history works. An invention is not judged only by whether it functions. It is judged by who controls the system around it. Can it be mass-produced? Can it be patented? Can it be monetized? Can it be controlled? Can it be taxed? Can it be weaponized? Can it be allowed to exist without threatening all the industries? That is the real battlefield, because invention has never existed in a vacuum. Every major breakthrough enters a world already occupied by gatekeepers. Governments, financiers, industrial empires, scientific institutions, newspapers, militaries, monopolies. And if a new idea threatens the wrong structure at the wrong time, it may not be debated fairly. It may simply be smothered, not always in dramatic ways, not with masked men in dark hallways. Sometimes suppression is quiet, a meeting that never happens, a grant that is denied, a patent that sits, a prototype that gets acquired and disappears, a newspaper campaign that makes the inventor look unstable, a lawsuit, a safety concern, a strategic delay. You don't always have to destroy an invention. Sometimes you only need to delay it long enough for the world to move on. And that is what makes Silenced Inventions so haunting. Because the question is not just what was lost. It's how early we could have had it. To Nikola Tesla, the inventor who saw too far, if there is one name that sits at the center of every conversation about erased inventions, it is Nikola Tesla. And the reason is obvious. Tesla was not merely an inventor. He was the kind of mind that makes history uncomfortable. He imagined systems, not just gadgets. He thought in networks, fields, frequencies, transmission, scale. He saw technology not as isolated devices, but as entire worlds of possibility. Today, Tesla's fame is almost mythologized, but for a long time, he was remembered only in fragments, often as an eccentric genius overshadowed by more commercially successful rivals. That matters, because when a person is remembered as brilliant but strange, it becomes easier to reduce their unrealized work to fantasy, and that is where the mystery begins. Tesla helped transform electricity itself through his work on alternating current. That part of history is real, concrete, undeniable. But beyond it lies the territory that keeps his name alive in mystery circles. Wireless power transmission, global energy networks, large-scale energy distribution without traditional infrastructure. Concepts so ambitious that they seem to threaten the way power, literal and political, would be owned. And then came Wardenclyffe Tower. Wardenclyffe was supposed to be something extraordinary. At minimum, it represented a bold wireless communication vision. At maximum, depending on how one interprets Tesla's broader intentions, it symbolized a future where energy and information could move in radically different ways than the systems being built by industrial giants. But Wardenclyffe was never completed as Tesla imagined. Funding collapsed. Support evaporated. Backers lost confidence or lost interest. The project stalled. Eventually, the tower was demolished. And this is where the public imagination splits in two. One version says Tesla's ideas became too impractical, too expensive, too visionary for the engineering and economics of the time. The other version says Tesla was dangerous to the emerging business model of controlled energy infrastructure, and what he proposed could not be allowed to flourish. The truth may live in the tension between those interpretations, because suppression does not always require a secret conspiracy. Sometimes the market itself acts like a conspiracy. If a system cannot profit cleanly from an invention, that invention becomes inconvenient. Tesla's story survives because it touches a nerve deeper than electricity. It asks a question modern civilization still cannot answer honestly. If someone invents a better future, but that future threatens powerful interests, does the world adopt it or bury it? Through the car that ran too differently. There is a recurring pattern in the history of transportation. Every time a radically different energy system appears, the same arguments rise around it. Too expensive, too early, too impractical. No infrastructure, too risky, no demand. Sometimes these arguments are true. Sometimes they are camouflage. And nowhere is the tension more visible than in the long history of alternative vehicle technologies. For over a century, inventors have explored engines and propulsion systems that did not fit neatly into the fossil fuel model that came to dominate the modern world. Electric vehicles existed earlier than many people realize. So did experiments with steam, hybrid concepts, unusual fuel systems, and highly efficient mechanical designs. But dominance in history does not automatically mean superiority in every category. It often means compatibility with capital, logistics, and war. Oil was dense, transportable, profitable, and deeply strategic. That gave it power beyond engineering merit alone. So when people talk about suppressed engines or cars that disappeared, they are often reaching toward a real historical tension, even when specific claims become exaggerated. Because here is the undeniable truth. Not every transportation path was explored equally. Some were starved. Some were delayed. Some were allowed only when they could be folded into a profitable system. That means the modern vehicle landscape may not simply be the result of the best technology winning. It may also be the result of which technologies fit the interests of the age. And once you understand that, the more dramatic stories the lost prototype, the inventor who dies obscure, the patent bought and shelved no longer feel impossible. They feel structurally plausible. That is the unsettling thing about silenced inventions. Even when a specific legend is exaggerated, the environment that makes suppression believable is real. For the inventor vs. the industry, we often romanticize inventors as heroes battling ignorance. But in real history, inventors do not usually battle ignorance. They battle systems. A new invention can threaten an existing factory network, a military supply chain, a peasant portfolio, a public utility model, a chemical industry, a medical revenue stream, a transportation monopoly, a media ecosystem. That means the danger of invention is not always technical. It is economic. A device can work perfectly and still be treated like a threat. In fact, that is often when it becomes most dangerous. Because once money is involved, the question changes. No longer, does it work? Now, what does it destroy by working? If an invention makes a profitable process obsolete, it doesn't enter an empty market. It enters a battlefield. And history is full of battlefields the public never sees. Boardrooms, patent offices, closed demonstrations, non-disclosure agreements, delayed launches, strategic acquisitions, quiet legal pressure. This is one of the reasons so many breakthrough stories feel unfinished. Not every important invention gets a dramatic death. Some are simply neutralized. Five the water-powered dream between hope and myth. Few invention legends have survived as stubbornly as the dream of a cop powered by water. The claim appears again and again in different decades under different names, with different inventors and different mechanisms. A garage genius says he found a new approach. A small prototype appears. A demonstration impresses a few people. Then confusion begins. Supporters claim the invention threatens energy empires. Skeptics say the science is misunderstood or misrepresented. The inventor becomes controversial. The media turns hostile or dismissive, and the story drifts into rumor. Now, to be precise, many water car claims fail under scientific scrutiny as they are popularly described. Water is not a magical free fuel in the simplistic way many viral stories suggest. But that is not the most interesting part of the pattern. The interesting part is why people keep believing these stories. Because the legend survives not only on technical claims but on social instinct. People know, at some level, that major energy systems are tied to enormous power. They know industries protect themselves. They know patents can disappear into corporate portfolios. They know genuine innovation can be crushed by money long before the public sees it. So even when a specific water engine story is weak, the emotional logic behind it remains powerful. What if we really did come close to a cleaner system, and it was smothered before it could mature? That question is bigger than one inventor. It is about trust. And once trust and the fairness of innovation collapses, every missing technology begins to look like sabotage. 6 medical inventions that never got their moment. Of all silence invention stories, medical ones may be the most emotionally explosive. Because in medicine, delay is not abstract. Delay means suffering. Delay means death. Delay means someone somewhere might have lived differently if an idea had not been ignored, discredited, or buried. History is full of medical innovations that were initially mocked, resisted, or rejected, not always because they were wrong, but because they challenged established beliefs, habits, or hierarchies. A surgeon suggests washing hands. A doctor proposes a new theory of disease. An outsider presents a treatment method that established institutions refuse to examine seriously. Again and again, history shows the same ugly truth. Medicine, like every other field, is vulnerable to ego. A system does not always reject a new idea because the idea is false. Sometimes it rejects the idea because the wrong person introduced it, or because accepting it would mean admitting previous failure. Now, that does not mean every cure they don't want you to know about story is real. Many are exaggerated or false. But the larger pattern that life-saving or life-improving ideas can be delayed for reasons that are social, institutional, or financial is absolutely real. And that is enough to make the topic dangerous. Because once the public sees that medicine has, at times, resisted truth, the boundary between justified skepticism and reckless conspiracy becomes unstable. That is why silenced inventions are so powerful. They do not just tell us something about machines. They tell us something about human institutions. They are not designed to reward truth automatically. They are designed to protect themselves first. 7WAR, the great distorter of invention. If you want to understand why some inventions vanish, you have to understand war. War accelerates technology, but it also distorts it. During wartime, governments fund aggressive innovation, but only for strategic advantage. That means inventions that are useful in war can leap forward rapidly, while inventions useful to everyday civilian life may be delayed, classified, repurposed, or ignored. A technology developed for defense might remain locked in secrecy for years. A medical or engineering breakthrough might be folded into military research and kept from the public sphere. An inventor might disappear into state systems where the original, broader civilian vision is lost. War doesn't just invent faster, it chooses favorites. And once a technology enters the machinery of state secrecy, public history becomes incomplete. That matters because many people imagine suppression only as corporate greed. But governments are just as capable of silencing inventions, not always forever, but long enough to reshape history. A classified decade is enough. A lost generation is enough. A delayed infrastructure shift is enough. And when the public finally receives a watered-down or controlled version years later, it may never realize how early the underlying idea existed. This is one of the most important themes in the history of erased inventions. Sometimes the invention is not destroyed. Sometimes it is absorbed. And once it is absorbed, its original story disappears. At the patent drawer where ideas go to sleep, there are a few modern symbols more chilling than this. An invention exists. It is patented. It is real enough to be documented. And then nothing. No rollout. No mass adoption. No industrial transformation. No public explanation proportionate to its promise. Just silence. Now, there are many innocent reasons inventions stall. Manufacturing is hard. Costs are high. Prototypes don't always scale. Some designs are brilliant in theory and weak in practice. But the patent system also creates a darker possibility. An idea can be owned without being used. And that means a powerful company does not always need to defeat a disruptive invention by arguing against it in public. Sometimes it only needs to buy it. That is enough. An invention purchased by a larger interest can be delayed, re-engineered, diluted, repurposed, varied, strategically shelved. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened, and that's what makes this mechanism so effective. There is no explosion, no scandal, no dramatic crime scene, just administrative disappearance. For the public, the effect is the same. The future arrives later than it could have. 9 inventions we only recognize too late. Some inventions aren't exactly silenced in the obvious sense. They are dismissed early, forgotten, and then rediscovered when the world is finally ready. That is a different kind of erasure. Not total destruction, but delayed recognition. An inventor builds something decades ahead of infrastructure. No one funds it. No one sees its value. The world shrugs. Then later, with new materials, new politics, new economics, the same concept returns, and suddenly it looks revolutionary. At that point, history often rewrites itself. The later version gets celebrated. The earlier inventor becomes a footnote. But a footnote can hide a tragedy. Because if the right idea arrives in the wrong era, it may spend decades buried under the laziness of institutions. So when we look at history, we should be careful with the phrase before its time. Sometimes before its time is a flattering way of avoiding a harsher truth. The time was available. The system simply chose something else. Tenderly beneath all silenced invention stories. Why do people obsess over erased inventions? Why do these stories survive generation after generation, even when some claims are exaggerated? Because underneath them is a fear that cuts straight to the bone of modern life. What if progress is not only discovered? What if progress is also withheld? That fear changes how you look at everything. It changes how you see energy, medicine, transportation, communication, food systems, defense technology, information networks. It suggests that history may not only be a story of what humanity achieved, it may also be a story of what humanity prevented itself from becoming. And that is what makes this subject so powerful, because the inventions themselves are not the only mystery. The mystery is the gate. Who stands in front of the future? Who decides what gets scaled? Who decides what gets laughed at? Who decides what gets classified? Who decides what gets bought and quietly shelved? When you ask those questions seriously, the world begins to look less like a clean progression of genius, and more like a struggle over who is allowed to shape reality. Part 1 closing, the future has enemies. In Part 1, we explored the core idea behind silenced inventions, that useful ideas do not automatically win, that power structures can delay or absorb, ridicule, starve, or bury innovation. That Tesla became the symbol of a future that may have arrived too early or been denied on purpose. That transportation, medicine, and energy have all been shaped not just by engineering, but by control. And that some inventions may not have failed because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient. But this is only the beginning, because in Part 2, we're going deeper into specific cases. The patents, the prototypes, the inventors, the industries, and the suspicious disappearances that made people wonder whether history was edited. Not every story will be proven. Not every legend will survive scrutiny. But that's exactly what makes this subject so dangerous. Because once you begin separating the myths from the patterns, you realize something unsettling. Even when the legend is false, the mechanism behind it may be very real. Part 2. The pattern starts to look deliberate. At first, it's easy to dismiss stories about erased inventions. One inventor fails. Another runs out of money. A strange prototype never scales. A patent sits unused. A lab closes. A breakthrough arrives too early. Any one of those things can happen by chance. But then you keep looking, and the pattern begins to repeat. An invention threatens an industry. The inventor is marked, isolated, or bought out. The technology disappears into paperwork, legal pressure, or strategic silence. Years later, sometimes decades later, the same idea returns in a safer form, under different names controlled by different hands. That's the moment the question changes. No longer, did one invention get buried? Now it becomes, how many futures were delayed before the public ever knew they existed? In part 1, we explored the big idea that useful inventions don't automatically win, and that history is shaped by power as much as by truth. In part 2, we go deeper into the machinery of disappearance, the patents that vanished into drawers, the technologies that were too early, the inventors whose ideas became inconvenient, and the industries that had every reason to make sure the future arrives slowly. Let's continue. One, the electric car wasn't new variety was remembered late. One of the most important facts in the history of invention is also one of the simplest. The electric car is not a modern idea. It only feels modern because history remembers it that way. Long before the 21st century turned electric vehicles into a symbol of innovation, electric cars already existed. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were real contenders in the early automotive world. That alone should make you pause. Because when people imagine technological progress, they imagine a clean sequence. Primitive machine, then better machine, then finally modern breakthrough. But transportation history was never that linear. In the early days, different vehicle systems competed. Steam, gasoline, electric, and for a brief moment, the future wasn't settled. Electric vehicles had advantages. They were quieter, cleaner at the point of use. They avoided some of the inconveniences of early gasoline technology. So why didn't they dominate? The standard explanation is familiar. Battery limitations, range issues, infrastructure weakness, advances in gasoline vehicle production, cheap fuel, mass manufacturing efficiencies. All of that matters, but there's a larger historical truth behind it. The world didn't simply choose the best machine. It chose the machine that fit the industrial age that was emerging. Gasoline aligned with large-scale extraction, refining, transport, war logistics, and a growing network of infrastructure that could be expanded, taxed, controlled, and defended. That gave internal combustion more than technical momentum. It gave it political and economic gravity. And once the technology acquires gravity, competing systems do not merely lose a fair race. They get starved. Investment follows the dominant path. Media narratives follow the dominant path. Supply chains build around the dominant path. Governments plan around the dominant path. At that point, the free market of ideas becomes an illusion, because the race is no longer neutral. So when people say the electric vehicle was ahead of its time, they may be missing a harsher possibility. It wasn't merely early. It was crowded out by a world being built for something else. That doesn't require a secret meeting in a dark room. It only requires a system that rewards one energy model so completely that alternatives can't breathe. And that may be one of the most common ways inventions are silenced. Not by being destroyed, by being structurally suffocated. To the inventor who solves the wrong problem, here is something history teaches again and again. An inventor can fail not because the solution is bad, but because the solution attacks the wrong profit stream. That is a very different kind of failure. Imagine creating a product that makes another product unnecessary, or building a machine that drastically reduces consumption of something the economy is built on, or inventing a manufacturing process so efficient that it threatens an entire industry's margins. In theory, that should be celebrated. In reality, it can be dangerous, because powerful systems don't merely sell products, they protect dependencies. A fuel company doesn't only profit from fuel. It profits from a civilization designed around fuel. A pharmaceutical empire doesn't only profit from one drug. It profits from an ecosystem of treatment, distribution, regulation, and recurring need. A utility model doesn't only profit from power. It profits from the architecture of access. So if an invention reduces dependence, it can threaten more than revenue. It can threaten structure. And once structure is threatened, the response becomes less scientific and more strategic. The invention may be framed as unstable, unproven, unsafe, too expensive, unscalable, unrealistic, in need of a further review. Now, sometimes those critiques are genuine, but sometimes they are simply the polite language of defense. This is one of the reasons silenced invention stories often feel so plausible, because even if the details of a specific legend are exaggerated, we all understand, instinctively, that systems do not enjoy being made obsolete. They resist. To read the patent as a weapon, most people think of patents as shields. A patent is supposed to protect the inventor, to document originality, to create ownership, to reward creativity. But in practice, patents can also become weapons. A patent can protect an inventor, yes, but it can also be used to block one. Because in a world dominated by capital, the person with the better idea does not always win. Sometimes the person with the larger legal team wins. A large company can acquire patents it never intends to use. It can collect surrounding patents to build a defensive wall around an industry. It can challenge smaller inventors until they can no longer afford to fight. It can delay, camp to file, outspend, wait. And waiting is often enough. That's the chilling elegance of administrative suppression. No dramatic destruction. No visible villain. Just time, paperwork, and exhaustion. For an independent inventor, that is often fatal. Because invention is not only a technical act. It is a financial act, a legal act, a political act, a manufacturing act. A lone inventor may succeed in the lab and still die in the system. And that's why the myth of the garage genius changing the world while emotionally satisfying is incomplete. The garage is only the beginning. The real battle starts after the prototype works. For Royal Raymond Rife, the machine that became too controversial. In the history of suppressed medical invention stories, one of the most persistent names is Royal Raymond Rife. Rife claimed to have developed powerful microscopy methods and later became associated with frequency-based medical treatment ideas, particularly the claim that specific frequencies could affect disease-causing organisms. To supporters, Rife represented a breakthrough that threatened the foundations of conventional medicine and pharmaceutical economics. To skeptics, he represented a mix of exaggerated claims, disputed evidence, and scientific controversy. And that tension is exactly why he belongs in this series. Because Rife's story sits on the fault line between three powerful forces: genuine innovation, scientific rigor, institutional resistance. When those forces collide, the public often cannot tell what is being rejected because it is flawed and what is being rejected because it is threatening. That ambiguity is fertile ground for legend. Stories emerge to have destroyed labs, suppressed demonstrations, ruined reputations, and a medical establishment determined to keep disruptive approaches out of the mainstream. Now, whether every claim surrounding Rife survives scrutiny is not the point here. The point is structural. Rife became a symbol of a broader fear, that a medical idea might be crushed not through open scientific debate, but through institutional containment. And that fear persists because medicine has, historically, resisted important shifts before. The danger is obvious. Once people believe a cure, treatment, or diagnostic breakthrough can be buried, every rejected medical idea begins to look like suppression. That does not make every suppressed cure story true, but it makes the social psychology behind them incredibly powerful. Rife's legacy is not just about one machine. It is about how fragile public trust becomes when institutions appear capable of deciding what is allowed to heal. 5T, Henry Morey, and the Dream of Radiant Power. Few erased invention stories feel more like they were designed to survive in whispers than the story of T. Henry Morey. Morey became known for claims surrounding a device that supposedly accessed a form of radiant energy and generated usable electrical output without relying on conventional fuel in the usual way people expected. Supporters believed he had touched something revolutionary, a new approach to energy, a different doorway into power generation, something that, if scalable and real, would radically alter how civilization thought about electricity. And then came the familiar pattern: demonstrations, doubt, conflict, claims of sabotage, a world not ready or not willing to accept what it was seeing. This is the type of story that immediately splits audiences. One side hears it and thinks, impossible pseudoscience. The other side hears it and thinks exactly the sort of thing that would be buried. But once again, the most interesting part is not the final verdict on every technical claim. It is the recurring structure of the story, the disruptive energy device, the inventor outside the dominant system, the powerful implications, the suspicious resistance, the unfinished arc. Why does that pattern keep returning? Because energy is not just an industry, it is civilization's bloodstream, and any invention that promises radically different access to power will immediately enter the most heavily defended territory in modern history. That is why energy suppression stories never die. Even when a specific case is weak, the stakes are so high that people remain willing to believe, because everyone senses the same thing. If there is any category of invention the world would fight hardest to control, it would be energy. 6. The prototype that disappears after the demonstration. One of the eeriest recurring motifs in invention history is the public demonstration followed by disappearance. A small audience sees something strange, promising, or extraordinary. A report circulates. Witnesses argue. Maybe a local paper mentions it. Maybe investors show interest. And then the trail goes cold. No industrial expansion. No mainstream adoption. No follow-up equal to the claims. Just a faint residue of testimony, rumor, and unresolved possibility. Sometimes that happens because the invention didn't really work. That must be said clearly. But sometimes it happens because the demonstration is the easiest part. Scaling is harder. Protecting the inventor is harder. Defeating industry resistance is harder. Keeping momentum alive when powerful people are indifferent or hostile is harder. So when the public hears they showed it, and then it vanished, the imagination immediately activates. Was it bought? Threatened? Ridiculed into oblivion? Classified? Destroyed? The reason these stories are so sticky is that every answer feels plausible, because history has room for all of them. Some inventions vanish from weakness. Some vanish from pressure. Some vanish because their inventors are poor. Some vanish because their inventors are strange, arrogant, or impossible to work with. Some vanish because the world simply isn't configured to let them survive. Suppression doesn't always need a villain. Sometimes the system itself is enough. 7. The military shadow. If industry is one of invention's great gatekeepers, the military is another. Governments do not classify things for fun. They classify them because a useful invention is also a strategic asset. That means some of the most important inventions in modern history may not have been destroyed at all. They may have been redirected, taken out of civilian life, folded into defense research, hidden behind national security language, separated from the public timeline of technological progress. This matters because public history is often a delayed history. By the time ordinary people encounter a technology, it may have existed in some classified or semi-classified form for years. Communication systems, navigation, materials, sensing technologies, power systems, even medical or psychological tools. That creates a strange effect. The public experiences the invention as sudden. But the invention may have lived a long secret life already. Now, we must be careful here. Not every advanced idea has a secret military backstory, but enough to that the public has learned something important. Absence from public view does not equal non-existence. And once people internalize that lesson, every unexplained technological gap begins to look suspicious. Again, the power of silenced invention stories comes not from total proof. It comes from partial precedent. Enough real secrecy exists to make larger secrecy believable. At the ridicule stage, There is a stage in the life of many threatening ideas that deserves more attention than it gets. Before an invention is absorbed, blocked, or forgotten, it is often laughed at. Ridicule is one of the cheapest and most effective weapons in history. You do not have to disprove the inventor. You only have to make him look foolish. Call him unstable, obsessive, delusional, a crank, a dreamer, a fraud, a man who has confused ambition with reality. Once the inventor's public image is weakened, the invention becomes easier to dismiss without examination. That's what makes ridicule so elegant. It saves everyone the trouble of honest engagement. Now, of course, some inventors really are wrong. Some are cranks. Some are fraudulent. Some become consumed by their own legend. But ridicule as a social tool is dangerous precisely because it works on true and false claims alike. It does not test reality. It manages attention. And history is full of cases where important ideas were first treated as absurd before later becoming obvious. So whenever an invention story includes the inventor being mocked, isolated, or caricatured, it deserves more than a reflexive shrug. Because laughter has buried many things. Now, what if the world only gets safe versions of radical ideas? Here is one of the most unsettling possibilities in all of invention history. What if truly disruptive ideas are not usually released in their original form? What if the public doesn't get the breakthrough when it first appears? What if it gets a diluted version later, when the risk to existing power has been reduced? That would explain something strange about technological history. Why certain ideas seem to appear, disappear, and then reappear decades later in more acceptable forms. Why early inventors are forgotten while later corporations become the face of the same general concept. Why radical promise often turns into modest product. Because the world does not always reject the invention forever. Sometimes it waits until it can own it safely. That may be the cleanest form of suppression of all. No banning, no public scandal, no dramatic censorship, just containment until the conditions are right. If that is true even part of the time, then history is not only a record of invention, it is a record of timing control. Tend the question that won't go away. By now, the pattern should feel familiar. The early electric path that faded, the patent as weapon, the medical machine too controversial to survive cleanly, the energy inventor circling impossible promise, the prototype that vanishes after being seen, the military shadow, the ridicule stage, the delayed reappearance of safer versions. Each story has its own details. Each case has its own uncertainties. But together, they create a larger pressure on the mind. What if progress is curated? Not invented freely, not released freely, not scaled freely, but curated, allowed here, blocked there, accelerated for war, slowed for peace, funded when profitable, ignored when destabilizing. That possibility is what gives silenced invention stories their staying power. Because even when a legend becomes exaggerated, the deeper suspicion remains difficult to dismiss. The future is not neutral. It passes through gatekeepers, and gatekeepers are human. They have fear, bias, investments, egos, alliances, incentives. That means invention is never just about truth. It is about permission. Part 2 closing. The future is often released in stages. In Part 2, we move beyond the general idea of erased inventions and into the recurring mechanisms that make suppression believable. We saw that the electric car was not born in the modern age, only rediscovered there. We saw how patents can protect ideas or quietly suffocate them. We explored the controversial legacies of figures like Royal Raymond Rife and Henry Moray, whose names survive because they sit at the intersection of innovation and institutional discomfort. We looked at how military secrecy, ridicule, and structural pressure can make an invention disappear without ever needing a dramatic takedown. And most importantly, we arrived at a possibility more disturbing than total censorship. That some inventions are not destroyed. They are simply delayed, diluted, and released later, when the world can profit from them safely. But Part 3 goes deeper still, because in the final chapter, we ask the hardest question of all. What does it mean if the greatest inventions in history were not always lost by accident, but by design? We'll go into the psychology of suppression, the myth versus pattern problem, and the modern inventions people believe are still being held back right now. Part 3. The most dangerous invention isn't always the machine. And now, you've seen the pattern. An inventor creates something disruptive. A system feels threatened. The invention is delayed, absorbed, ridiculed, buried, or forgotten. Years later, the world receives a weaker version if it receives anything at all. But Part 3 is not really about a single machine. It's not only about Tesla, hidden patents, controversial energy devices, or medical breakthroughs that never got their chance. It's about something deeper, because the most dangerous invention is not always the machine itself. Sometimes the most dangerous invention is independence. An invention becomes threatening the moment it reduces dependence. Dependence on fuel, dependence on institutions, dependence on a supply chain, dependence on centralized control, dependence on gatekeepers who profit from being necessary. That is why some ideas don't just face skepticism, they face resistance. And once you understand that, history begins to look different. One, history doesn't only reward genius, IT rewards compatibility. We like to believe the best idea wins. But history shows something much colder. The idea that wins is often the one most compatible with the existing structure of power. If an invention makes life better, that matters. But if it also threatens an industry, destabilizes a monopoly, weakens a state advantage, or changes who controls access to energy, medicine, or information, then suddenly it is not judged as an invention. It is judged as a threat. That is the hidden filter behind so much of technological history. And once an idea is filtered through power, truth is no longer enough to protect it. That is the real tragedy of silenced inventions. Not every lost breakthrough was impossible. Not every forgotten prototype was fake. Not every failed inventor was wrong. Some simply collided with a world that had no intention of letting them survive. To the line between myth and suppression, there is a reason this subject is so hard to talk about honestly. Because some stories are exaggerated. Some are built on incomplete evidence. Some turn inventors into legends and legends into mythology. But that does not mean the whole subject is fantasy. In fact, that's what makes it dangerous. If every story were fake, the topic would be easy to dismiss. If every story were proven, the topic would be impossible to ignore. Instead, we live in the most unsettling middle ground. A world where some claims are myths, but the mechanisms of suppression are real. Patents can be shelved. Inventors can be discredited. Funding can vanish. Military secrecy can absorb technologies. Industries can protect themselves. The media can decide who looks credible and who looks insane. So even when one story falls apart, the larger fear remains alive, because the public has already learned the most important lesson. History is not just written by winners. It is filtered by them. What if the future arrives only when it's safe for power? This may be the most disturbing possibility of all. Not that inventions are destroyed forever, but that they are timed, held back until they can no longer threaten the existing order, released only when infrastructure is ready to control them, introduced only when profit can be secured, packaged only when a disruptive edge has been removed. If that happens even occasionally, then the story of progress is incomplete. Because progress would not simply be the story of discovery, it would also be the story of permission. And that raises a question that should bother anyone who cares about the future. How many technologies could have changed ordinary life earlier? How many people suffered longer because useful ideas were delayed? How much of modern civilization is not only what we invented, but what we were allowed to keep? That is the shadow hanging over every silenced invention. Not just loss, delay. And delay can reshape history as effectively as destruction. For the inventor's real enemy, people often think inventors fight ignorance. Sometimes they do, but more often, the inventor's real enemy is inertia backed by money. A giant system does not need to prove a new invention impossible. It only needs to make adoption convenient. That is enough. Enough delay, enough doubt, enough friction, enough legal resistance, enough ridicule, and the future misses its moment. That is how a civilization can quietly lose decades without noticing. Because lost invention does not always feel like theft. Sometimes it feels like normal life. You grow up assuming the world reached technology at the pace it was supposed to, using cleaner energy, smarter medicine, more efficient design, or better systems arrived exactly when they could have. But what if they didn't? What if the timeline itself was manipulated by power, fear, and controlled release? That is why this topic refuses to die, because it does not only accuse the past, it challenges the present. 5. The final warning. The real danger is not only that inventions were silenced back then, it's that the same forces still exist now. Power still protects itself. Industry still resists disruption. Governments still classify strategically useful technologies. Media still shapes credibility. Money still decides what scales and what disappears. So the question is no longer historical. It becomes immediate. What is being delayed now? What is being bought and shelved now? What inventor is being ignored now because their breakthrough threatens the wrong system? We may never know all the answers, but history gives us enough evidence to be cautious about one comforting lie, that progress is automatic. It isn't. The future has to survive contact with power, and sometimes it doesn't. Closing, some inventions don't die, they wait. Maybe not every legend is true. Maybe not every erased invention could have changed the world, but some of them might have, and that possibility is enough to haunt history, because some inventions don't fail from weakness. Some disappear because they arrive at the wrong time, in front of the wrong people, with consequences too large to be welcomed. So when you look at the world around you, the energy you use, the medicine you trust, the machines you depend on, remember this. What exists is only part of the story. The other part is what never got the chance. And sometimes the most important inventions in history are not the ones we celebrate, but the ones we almost had. Thanks for watching Silenced Inventions, Erased from History. If you enjoyed this series, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next documentary. And tell me in the comments, which invention do you think the world lost too early?